But so okay, I often hear people say that like the different sects in Islam in that region, or sects of Islam, uh, is a key reason as far as the tension and disorder in the
Yes.
region. And so, what do you guys think? To like, what degree does that actually play into the issue? And then, what are like the
Uh,
key differences between these sects? Like, what is? I mean, outside of like who is the successor of Muhammad, because most people understand that basic key difference, but there has to be more than that.
well, so if we're talking about if it causes divides right now, the answer is yes. These various nations have basically used the sectarian violence as a political tool. You know, Iran and Saudi Arabia are both funding their respective sectarian militias. We kind of see it with the Muslim Brotherhood with Saudi Arabia and the various groups that Iran props up, like Hezbollah and the PMU in Iraq and whatever else they're funding at the moment.
Yeah, the Quds
But
Brigade and all that.
yeah, the Quds Brigade, and well, but that's pretty much a modern thing. Of course, there's always been that tension, but you have to imagine that all the previous caliphates and all the previous empires that Muslims have been a part of, they've had a lot of schools of thought. Very like it's not just two Sunni and Shia. We're talking about many schools of thought, and
Yeah,
they've
like
grown.
Wahhabism and things like that, right?
Yeah, and even Wahhabism is a pretty modern idea. Like the Wahhab, what it's named after, he was only born in what the 1700s. But before that, there were many different schools of thought that preached different things. You know, you had the more logical type, the more fundamentalist. The I don't know what the name of them. The ones that killed Ali. Do you know what the name of them are? Tariq.
No, no idea.
Whatever.
So,
The point is that there was a lot, and even the ones that were considered more extreme, they ended up getting killed by what we would consider Sunnis today. Because again, like this wasn't this wasn't a dichotomy back then. You know, there was more room for interpretation and people debating and figuring out what they believed in different schools of thought. But now it's pretty much solidified into Sunni and Shia, primarily from Saudi Arabia and Iran. Like they're the main factors here because they're the ones that are producing all the militants, all the funding, all
So,
the advocates.
so then
So
has Islam almost become a tool or a catalyst for nationalism and the spread of their own influence? Because
mm,
as I understand, Iran and Saudi Arabia have had some contentions for quite some time in the region, battling for supremacy, and um, it would just make sense that if you're saying that the majority of one religion or one sect is coming out of one area and the majority of another sect is coming out of another area, that it's almost as if both sides are it must be tied to something larger than just religion,
mm.
because obviously there's some political reasons behind it.
Um,
well, yeah, it has been weaponized. That's what I'm trying to get at with Saudi Arabia and Iran. Because if you look at something like Sufism in the Caucasus, I mean, there's no Sufi militias. I mean, maybe it's debatable, but we don't know any prominent Sufi militias going around and committing terror attacks in the West. Like the reason that the Sunni and Shia, specifically the Wahhabism and whatever theological group that Iran is a part of, the reason that they're so popular right now is because they're the ones that are funding everything, right? They're the ones that are currently in proxy wars. They're the ones, sending out imams to go preach whatever message they want. They're at the forefront of this. Um, when I'm referencing these different theological schools back in, say, the Umayyad Caliphate, there was no fighting about this. They were just different schools of thought that people went and learned about. I don't know what you think about it, Tariq.
no, I think that the thing here is that Islam is not being only used as nationalism. It's more of an identity enabler in a way, especially in the highly sectorized societies like Syria, Iraq. I would say that religion is playing this identity lingering role, and perhaps indeed it's being used as a tool. To be honest, I wouldn't say to nationalism, but to the politics of the region. Just like you said, it had Saudi Arabia using its Wahhabi Sunni Islam to influence its targets in the region, and just the same with Iran and Shia Islam. So I wouldn't say that's being used as nationalism per se, but as a tool of identity and politics in many ways.
And Also, another thing to take into consideration is that when, for example, Syria and Iraq were doing pretty well relatively,
Oh yes, we have to add that.
there was no influence of Wahhabism or the Shia trying to go in and influence. I mean, they tried. The Iranians sent a lot they were called the Dawa Party in Iraq. They sent a lot of them to try to, rile up people, but it wasn't really successful because people were doing good. If you look at the current state of Syria and Iraq, they're doing really poorly economically. The people are suffering. They're war torn, and that causes people to become more extreme. They're more polarized. They go to their sects. They go to their in-group, right? And they're more susceptible to these outside sources coming in and saying, hey, we're going to provide this for you, and you need to listen to us because we're part of you, you're part of us. It's like a safety blanket.
Oh.
And if you go back like 50 years, this wasn't really the case.
I'd like to just add that indeed we've been talking about the Sunni and Shia split here, but perhaps there's this third actor that's been much more preeminent earlier on. There was secular nationalism, secular Arabic nationalism, which is today is not playing so much its role. Its role has been waning a lot with the rise of sectarianism. But indeed, before that, especially in the second half of the 20th century, I'll say that the secular Arab nationalism was playing this much more intense role than sectarian politics. Not just say that there wasn't, for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood or other sectarian actors in play, but I'll say that's perhaps what left this power vacuum in the region in a way of you see this movement waning down and these Shia Sunni forces trying to take into that power vacuum.
So is it just those two, or are there like multiple factions? Because I understand, I mean, and maybe I know I'm coming from an ignorant perspective, but like you have many, like say Syria for example. Syria has so many different, at least the last I was looking at it, they have so many different parties who are fighting for power there. Now, not just the large powers like the U.S. and Russia and things like that, but you have like, factions like ISIS and the Kurds and all these different people who are coming here and there. So, I mean, to what degree do those people play into the ultimate issue as well? Because they have their own perspective on Islam and how it should be how it should be practiced and how it should be enforced in society and things like that.
Well, I mean, so to touch upon what Tarek was saying, post the fall of these British puppet kings, we could say, and the rise of the secular leaders like, the Ba'ath in Syria and Iraq, and then the secular leaders in Egypt and Libya. These people they didn't advocate for any type of sectarian politics, right? Like the Ba'ath Party in Syria and Iraq, which you most commonly see them reference with Saddam and Assad. They were both the Ba'ath Party was founded by a Christian, right? That's what we're talking about by it's secular in its nature. So we didn't see these problems, but once things started collapsing and sectarianism seeped its way in, then we saw the polarization, which led to the problems in Syria right now. If we're talking about Kurds, they're not really religious. Like, I mean, sorry, they are very religious, but they're not very, sectarian, I guess. They're very much focused on their ethno-state, not so much on what Wahhabism or anything else.
Yeah, they just want their own country at that point.
Yeah.
And within Syria itself, you don't have many different sects. Well, you have the Alawites, which are kind of a deviation of Shia, which is the ruling party at the moment. The majority of the population is Sunni. What else, Tark? You have the smaller minorities like the Druze.
Oh, don't forget the Christians.
Yeah, of course, the Christians. So there was a pretty sizable Christian minority in the Middle East. The Assyrians, which they're just Orthodox. So the main players, though, are going to be the Sunnis and Shias. That's really who decides what's going on at the moment. The other minorities don't really play a part. We saw a lot of migration of the Christians in Iraq and Syria post the wars, the respective wars. I think in Iraq it went from 1 million population to 500,000 post 2003.
I think 300,000 even.
Oh yeah, it's probably less because, these secular leaders, they were very protective of their population and their minorities. Not so much the Kurds. They've always kind of been, for lack of a better term, shit on. But
Yeah,
everyone else
that's
has
a
been
good
collectively
way to put
protected.
No, but
And go ahead.
it's just so that indeed the minorities kind of tend to bond together in a way. For instance, both Saddam and Hafiz in Syria, they were both from their respective sects. Saddam was Sunni, Hafiz was Shia, and both of them were pretty much minorities in their own countries. And to some extent, other minorities tend to jump in the same bandwagon as these secular leaders for lack of protection, because, well, they're a minority too, so we gotta stick together, boys.
Gotta stick together, boys.
Get your stuff together. But then again, it's a complex subject. Of course, then again scratching the surface here.
Oh yeah. And like you said earlier, like you'd have to make a whole podcast series just to touch one of these questions. Just for the listeners and for our own, conscious, we're not actually delving deep enough to fully answer the question, because again, that would take forever. But okay, so I was doing some research, and often you hear this rhetoric here in the United States that Sharia law. You keep hearing that term.
Shakira law. Shakira law.
Her hips don't lie. But but when I was reading up on it, it from what I understand, it's not necessarily a system of laws, but it's more like a set of principles, and then laws in society tend to arise from those set of principles.
Indeed.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's not black and white. It's not like the Ten Commandments that are just laid out. It's a lot more up to interpretation, right? So Sharia just means law. It's the translation of Sharia.
Yeah, it's like law.
And what it is it's yeah.
So Sharia law is just law.
So it's basically a collection of interpretations from the Quran and the Hadiths, more so the Hadiths. I think, just to preface this, Tariq and I are not very religious at all. So most of this is just through our experience as Middle Easterners and understanding of the basic concept. So that being said, so in each country, you kind of have the scholars, that are blessed by the state, that go in and they look and they say, okay, these are the laws that apply to the state, and this is how we're going to apply them. Obviously, you see differences between each state that considers themselves having Sharia law. In Iran, it's totally permissible and even subsidized by the state in some cases to be transsexual. They consider that more beneficial than being gay. So a lot of gay people will end up being go get their state subsidized tranny surgery.
Wait. So in Iran, it's more acceptable to be a transsexual than it is to be homosexual.
Yeah, so that's their interpretation of Sharia law. Whereas in Saudi Arabia,
I'm just like, I don't know.
Whereas in Saudi Arabia, they have this kind of shoot-on-sight mentality for anybody that deviates from the norm, right? So that's just one example of many that produces differences in Sharia. And then we have different countries, and I think Tariq will touch on this a little bit more, but in Syria, their constitution, even though they're a very secular country, was based around Sharia,
Yeah.
And we look at Assad's Syria and we say, well, they're not extremists, they're not very religious, but even then, they have their own interpretation of Sharia. So it's not this monolith that Americans make it seem. A lot of them kind of think that, I don't know what they think, that some book just dropped on the ground and it's Sharia law and it all says the same exact thing and everyone has to abide by it or something. It's a lot more complicated than that.
So,
Tariq, if you want to touch upon
that. What is Tariq think?
I just gotta say that I'm no law expert or student or anything, and I know that law is complicated as it is. But forgive me if I don't use the precise terms. But indeed, Sharia is basically basing itself on the Quran and how lawfare should work, how sentences should be played or fining, and as a matter of jurisprudence, we have the hadiths, which are comments or elaborations on sacred law that came centuries afterwards. And I mean, of course, the earlier hadiths that came just after the birth of Islam are regarded as more, you know, they have much more credit than the most modern ones. They are kind of this jurisprudence touch to the Sharia. Well, the idea here is that just like Western law is based on Greco-Roman principles of law and justice, as a matter of fact, Arab countries tend to adopt the Sharia as this base. Just as Omar was saying, you can have countries that go really deep into very, very literal interpretations of the Quran, and you can have very secular countries like Syria, Iraq, and even to some extent Lebanon basing themselves in the Sharia for their constitutions. And what does that mean? Does it mean that you have to kill gays on sight and stuff like that? Not necessarily, but it is that many things, for instance, the transfer of goods. Here in the West, we tend to consider, for instance, transfer of goods of citizenship or heritage to come from both mother and father, sometimes even from aunts and such. In the Syrian Sharia-based constitution, it always flows from the father or the father of the mother. So it's something very patrilinear, something very, you know, manly and all that. So that's one of the ways the Sharia can play a part in being the base for a constitution, even if it's a very progressive constitution, as a matter of fact. But of course, we have so many schools in Islam. It's just so many schools, and by schools I mean these schools of thought. Basically, the traditions of how you should interpret even though it's a Sunni school or Shia school, you're still gonna see a lot of these different interpretations, and this is where it gets interesting, because indeed, depending on the school, of course, the law is gonna change a lot. So then we have the Wahhabi schools, the famous one, where they interpret in a very literal, very raw way the legislation. For instance, where you had it back in the Islamic State, where you had the public executions, you had money couldn't be, you know, paper currency or, you know, fiat money, had to be gold standard money, because otherwise it's haram to not use gold money. And so of course you're going to have very backwards values if you take a very literal interpretation of the book. Just like with the Bible, if you take, for instance, the two books in the Bible that kind of touch more upon law, which is the Leviticus and the Timothy in the New Testament, you're going to see a lot of stuff that, no, this is not compatible with our society today. And that's more or less what these guys are for. I mean, we have to update our laws, even though they're based in this book. We have to adapt them to our society today. We live in a society that's much different from the one we had before.
Yeah, and also I just want to caveat that we can thank the British for propping up the Saud family with the Wahhabs. Thank you so much, the British Empire, for unleashing this scourge upon us all that we have to suffer with. Thank you. I just wanted to add that. You can continue.
Yeah, I think we should touch upon that later on, because one of the questions that's coming now is about Wahhabis. So that's going to be interesting.
Well, okay, so I was doing a little bit more research, and I also found that, like you were saying, there's different schools of thought within Islam. You know, you have the Wahhabism, you know, you have the
Hanbali. There's like so many. It's great. It's great. Like Sufi.
But then it's not only just what school of thought, but then the degree in which you implement that school of thought. So then you would have things like a liberal Muslim, a conservative Muslim, an Islamist, a radical. And I guess that kind of goes into my question as like, when you hear in the media, people talk about radical Islam all the time, but what does that really even mean? Like, to what degree do you need to take Islam before you become a radical? And to that same question, would you consider like the Pope a radical Christian because he lives his life 100% devoted to that faith?
Yeah.
Like, what is the term radical? And how do you
guess
define
like
it?
the modern interpretation would be Wahhabism or Salafist. But again, this isn't really an old revelation. I keep blaming the British because they caused this, but
they caused this.
Yeah,
I don't mean the British are behind everything, but they're behind everything.
By them propping up the Wahhab family and giving them legitimacy to fight the Ottomans. Okay, just to put it in perspective, the Ottomans were a society that allowed gay people, right? They were very permissive of gay people in their country, and they're considered a country that implemented Sharia law. But the Wahhabs were very, very, I guess, hardline. They were considered more legitimate in the eyes of the British, and they were used as propaganda, right? These are the guys you got to listen to because they're correct and they're more legitimate than this degenerate Ottoman Empire,
pious and whatever.
Yeah, more pious and all that. And the Wahhab family has pretty much developed the ideology of what we consider the extremist of the modern day, like the Salafist. And ISIS has a similar ideology. Al-Qaeda has a similar. The Mujahideen have a similar ideology, and they're all getting funded by the same source. The Muslim Brotherhood, which have been around forever. They've been trying to do their thing since the 60s. They tried in Syria. They tried in Egypt. They got kicked out by their secular leaders, respectively.
Or genocide.
But now,
Okay, so I hate to break your thought real quick, but like, okay.